Hey everyone. So, it goes without saying, but this episode marks the end of the Zoro vs. King fight, and included in this is a reveal of King's face, as well as a flashback to when he first met Kaido. Which, right out of the gate, I do believe they added maybe a few extended moments in the flashback itself. Unfortunately, nothing too much worth mentioning there, which is a shame, because I think they could have gotten away with maybe showing one scene, like a still frame shot of how Queen joined them too, but again, I get why they didn't do that. They wanted to keep it Queen to King and how King and him met. Although, with that said, in terms of the actual backstory, it is interesting how the series always does find a parallel of some kind to draw between how captains meet their number two, their second in commands, their number twos, or their first mates. And in case of the obvious parallel you could draw between Kaido King and Luffy Zoro is that despite being held captive by the government and eventually escaping with both Kaido and Luffy respectively, in King's case, both Kaido and King in their own way started their journey basically bright-eyed and optimistic, having high hopes for their futures and trusting each other implicitly. Even today, King served Kaido loyally right up until the end. And while the same could technically be said about Kaido in relation to his trust with King, it also true that there's a stark difference between how Kaido was back then and how he is now. When you look at Kaido back then compared to now, Kaido is much more rigid in his beliefs. As you can see that the experiences he's gone through have almost kind of forced him to abandon a lot of his previously held principles and just in general his outlook on the world and generally his optimistic outlook in favor of a purist belief of might makes right, that strength and power is all that's needed to survive in this world. And don't get me wrong, Kaido to some degree has always believed in strength and power, but he also believed in the idea of gathering people around him. Whereas today it always feels like might makes right takes precedent over gathering people around him now. It's just purely on the might makes right angle now. And to be frank, no matter which way you look at it, Kaido still to this day isn't entirely wrong for thinking that, but in doing so, I think it might have put a lot more burden on King's shoulders. King in the present, he's much more. It feels like he's carrying a much larger burden on his shoulders. In order for the sake of Kaido, because he all for the purpose because he genuinely wanted to see his captain's dream become reality, and because as we learn, he genuinely believed that Kaido was Joy Boy. So in doing so, he sort of took on Kaido's burdens as well as his own. Contrast that though with Luffy and Zoro, who also met during a run-in with the government, but unlike Kaido and King, who they themselves never once have their struggles together forced them to compromise their principles and beliefs in order to shoulder the other's burdens, because it is what gives them the ability to push past their limits and grow stronger for their own sakes. And in growing stronger for their own sakes, they make for their own sakes, they by proxy grow stronger in order to protect the ones in order to fight for the ambitions and the goals of the ones they care about. And they never lose focus of that. Point. But arguably in service of always being by Kaido's side, in always fighting for Kaido, you could argue these are things that King arguably lost sight of because he only ever fought for Kaido. He never fought for himself. in a way. Like, I know it sounds a little weird in the way I'm describing it, but it could be argued that that King's like sole focus on wanting to be there for Kaido, to fight for Kaido. You could argue it is kind of what that singular focus is kind of what made him lose. Now, with that said, art and animation is an interesting thing to talk about this week, because obviously art and animation was absolutely phenomenal, off the charts, absolutely bonkers. Although this is where it's going to sound strange, and hopefully people don't take this the wrong way, but this is definitely an episode where I kind of wish the artists and animators maybe pulled back a little bit more on the usual flash and flair they give these episodes. Because while it's not necessarily a bad thing to have it, it maybe made the final moments of the fight feel a little less epic. Like, don't get me wrong, the way the final moments of this episode were depicted were amazing. They were epic, they were grand in scale, that they were everything it needed to be, in ways that only One Piece could provide. But I don't know, maybe because the entire episode was like that, that ultimately it made the final big attack from Zoro feel a little diluted in terms of impact, because we already know, because I think it's one of those things where we already saw so much of that through the rest of the episode, that despite the animators throwing absolutely everything into those final moments, it felt, I don't know, just it felt lacking compared to every other moment like that, I guess. I don't know. I sound weird for saying that, but it's something I couldn't help but shake when watching this episode. And here's the thing. I am not discrediting any of the work that was put into this episode, whether the artists, all the work the artists, the animators, the directors, everyone just put into this episode and that final and that finale. Because don't get me wrong, this art and animation wise, this episode was an amazing, point blank. And they threw everything in the kitchen sink to make that final clash as big as possible, to really make us feel the scale and weight of King's power as a Lunarian, and to really make it look like Zoro had to truly become a demon in this moment in order to oppose King. But again, perhaps in some ways to its detriment, mainly because everything else felt like as big as that clash as well. With that said, though, yeah, obviously we do gotta talk about the fact that King's face is on full display in this episode, and that he is something called it fully reveals himself as a Lunarian. Which, yeah, if you couldn't tell, the series is making very heavy allusions to the idea that Lunarians are angels, more or less, with King's appearance. And honestly, this just further illustrates how the celestial dragons really are nothing but false gods. But of course, this also begs the question, one to wonder, just who or what used to live on Marie's Joie and the Red Line before Eam and the government assumed power, if a group like the Lunarians lived there? Like, are we really talking like an actual god who created everything in this world? Or like, what's the deal there? Like, and even more so, who is Eam? Like, what kind of power does he have? Is he the god of this world, or did he steal that power? Like, what's the deal there? With that said, yeah, the episode pretty much, there's not much more to say about this episode. It pretty much ends with Zoro standing victorious, which, from my recollection of the manga, this fight actually ended a little bit differently than it did here, and honestly, rather than a big epic pose, I think it ended with him just kind of falling flat on his back, just kind of in a near-death state kind of thing. And I think that's how it ended. And if that is the case, I would have preferred they show him completely drain and collapse, but I imagine they wanted to save that reveal for a later episode. And ultimately, I guess the reason I'm bringing this up is the moment I'm talking about really doesn't lead anywhere or mean anything to the story in regards to Zoro, other than, I guess, to signify he was really that close, per se. Like, it's hard to be vague enough without spoiling anything, but just trust me when I say you'll know what I mean when you see it, that this is the most vulnerable you will see Zoro ever. But yeah, guys, that's pretty much all I got for this review. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe. I'm on Twitter, Analyst Control. Be sure to notification bell, hit the subscribe button, and just shiver. And guys, Dark Knight of Enemy signing off. Later, everyone.